Well, good morning, everybody. I can see our audience is gradually arriving. I dare say there'll be a few latecomers, but we'll make a start and they can catch up as they go. So welcome. This is our last Sustainable Business Network for Winchester meeting of the year, and probably our most important. We start talking about COP26, what's happened and what we're going to do next. We're going to be doing a couple of polls and questions throughout the session today, which will be done on your phone via QR codes. So Wendy pops the first one up now. If you grab your phones, and we have a feedback form, which will be you can fill in as you go, so we can get your feedback on the speakers and the sort of quality of each talk. So be kind, but we are very interested to know whether you're finding our talks useful or not. So this is the feedback form. So if you can scan that with your phone, and we'll catch your feedback as we go through the morning. I haven't got any particular notices today, so I'm going to hand you straight over to Professor Robert Beckford, who's chair of the Institute of Climate and Social Justice at the University of Winchester, and so has particular interest for us in this context about this sort of just transition to the low carbon future that we're all anticipating eagerly. So very interested to hear what Robert has to say about COP and about his work. So Robert, over to you.
Yeah, good morning and thank you for inviting me. I hope you can all hear me and all see my slides on screen. Just a little bit about the Institute. The focus of the University's Institute for Climate and Social Justice is the intersections of climate change and social justice in global communities. We have to remember that sex, gender, race, and socioeconomic inequality and discrimination cut through many of the environmental issues confronting our planet, whether we're talking about air pollution in London or drought in sub-Saharan Africa. So we're attempting basically to look at these entanglements and therefore encourage researchers and NGOs and the business community to think about how their race to carbon neutrality has an impact in the wider socio-political world and on diverse communities. Just to talk about COP26 then, we took a group of students up to Glasgow for COP26 for a few days in order to engage with some of the conferences and fringe events taking place, as well as the mainstream activities, part of the university's long-standing commitment to climate and social justice and engaging the student populace. I also went up there alongside them. Naturally, as we have a focus on climate and social justice, these were the kind of entanglements that we were looking for throughout, and we made a note of them on the march that took place on the Saturday, the second Saturday during COP, because that was our particular focus. But turning to COP, seems to me that at the outset there were two themes that the organisers were keen to foreground. The first was by Boris Johnson, and Boris Johnson making note of the fact that this needed to be a history-making COP, one that future generations would look back on and celebrate rather than being critical of.
Half of the population of the world under 30, that the average age of this conclave of world leaders, I'm afraid to say, is over 60. I fully intend to be alive in 2060. I'll be a mere 94 years old, even if I'm not still in Downing Street. But but the children who will judge us are children not yet born, and their children. And we are now coming centre stage before a vast and uncountable audience of posterity, and we mustn't fluff our lines or miss our cue, because if we fail, they will not forgive us. They will know that Glasgow was the historic turning point when history failed to turn.
But you see, there were contradictions within the conference, because this conference followed on from the Paris COP, an agreement, and therefore there were long-standing contradictions that needed to be addressed, and these were brought to the fore by the Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, in her presentation at the start of COP, reminding people that although this needed to make history, there were historical issues that needed to be addressed from the previous COP that needed to also take on the global significance of what was taking place.
Your Royal Highness, Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. The pandemic has taught us that national solutions to global problems do not work. We come to Glasgow with global ambition to save our people and to save our planet. But we now find three gaps. On mitigation, climate pledges or NDCs. Without more, we will leave the world on a pathway to 2.7 degrees, and with more, we are still likely to get to 2 degrees. These commitments, made by some, are based on technologies yet to be developed, and this is at best reckless and at worst dangerous. On finance, we are $20 billion short of the $100 billion, and this commitment, even then, might only be met in 2023. On adaptation, adaptation finance remains only at 25%, not the 50-50 split that was promised nor needed given the warming that is already taking place on this earth. Climate finance to frontline small island developing states declined by 25% in 2019. Failure to provide the critical finance and that of loss and damage is measured, my friends, in lives and livelihoods in our communities. This is immoral and it is unjust. If Glasgow is to deliver on the promises of Paris, it must close these three gaps.
So how did Glasgow get on then in terms of dealing with these three gaps? Let's just work through some of the key outcomes then and how they impact on the UK context. Well, in terms of emissions, first of all, the countries kind of fudged this one. They agreed to meet next year to explore the pledges that were made in order to see how they can keep the temperature rise within the 1.2%, 1.5 degrees Celsius, which was the 1.5 to stay alive, which was one of the conference anthems circulating. If met, however, the current pledges will only limit global warming to around about 2.4 degrees centigrade. So there's still some work to be done on that matter. So consequently, a great criticism was made of the fact that some emitters to 2030 targets are so weak, particularly you heard about what's happening in China, Brazil and Russia, that they don't basically offer any kind of credible pathway to achieving their net zero targets. That's why Glasgow called on countries to revisit and strengthen their 2030 targets by the end of 22 to align them with the Paris Agreement's temperature goals. So still some work to be done on emissions, and as we'll see, there's a lot of criticism about that in particular. Secondly, then, in terms of adaptation and finance, there was a real play on words in the final draft. You notice it says urges. There is a list of words that are used in UN documents, and this is probably one of the weakest documents in terms of language use and semantics. So it urges parties to double their collective efforts in terms of provision for climate finance. And what's come out of this was some really powerful pledges. The Adaptation Fund reached unprecedented levels of contribution of 356 million more, and there's at least 400 million that was pledged to the Least Developed Countries Fund. But let's be clear about this. These are pledges and they are non-binding. So, you know, if anything that we can learn from the precedent, it rings true now. The precedent before from Paris was 100 billion a year, only of which around 80 billion was ever collected per year, 20 billion short, which has major implications. It was non-binding. And again, it's non-binding. So although the pledges were great, it's not a guarantee that they're going to be given. What about loss and damage then, this third category? Well, again, there was money that was promised, but it's seen as grossly insufficient. And the existing pledges, as mentioned before, still don't amount to the full amount that's needed, over 100 billion a year. And even 100 billion is considered to be insufficient to deal with the loss and damage that countries, particularly in the Southern Hemisphere, are experiencing through climate change. The UK government has said it is confident that the 100 billion target will be met by 2023. There's still a target, still non-binding, still not met. One good thing that came out of the conference is transparency. All countries now have to submit their information on emissions and financial and technological capacity building support using a common standardized set of formats and tables, and this will make it much more easier to understand and gauge where countries are, where they're at, and where they are, what improvements or what kind of regression has taken place, and that's something that will at least give us better data and a better understanding of what's happening in different parts of the world. There were some other points that were made that were significant. You may have heard in the news regarding the carbon markets, the double counting which was taking place, which was allowing some countries to play with the figures in terms of carbon emissions, has been challenged and stopped. Coal, massive attempts to disinvest from coal. 29 countries, including the UK, Canada, Germany, Italy, committed to new direct international public support for unabated fossil fuels by the end of 2020 and redirect this investment into clean energy. Over 400 million of 400 financial firms, which control 130 trillion in assets, committed to aligning their portfolios to net zero by 2030. And there's also a lot that's being done in terms of cities. Over 1,000 cities and local governments joined the cities race the city's race to zero, to raise climate action, to limit global temperatures to rise 1.5 degrees Celsius in around 41 cities and 31 countries, and 11 major automakers agreed to work towards selling only zero emission vehicles globally by 2040 and by no later than 2035 in leading markets. And we'll come back to that because there are some contradictions with that. So what then are some of the implications for business? Well, KPMG kind of highlighted these 3 points as being significant for the UK economy. Firstly, that more than ever before, we're looking at a bottom-up approach rather than a top-down approach. This was demonstrated by the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, which has 130 trillion of assets under its control. The whole idea is that the initiative now is with business. Clean finance can now play a critical role in driving or stopping activity, irrespective of changes in government policy. So the whole idea now is that the market itself has power. Business has power to drive the changes. There's a shift, therefore, then to bottom-up activity. Banks, insurers, and capital markets are now expected to drive action far greater extent than ever before. So there's a great sense of agency from business. But as Mia Motley mentioned earlier, some of the technologies that are necessary to move things on aren't necessarily developed just yet. Still some work to be done. So how did Glasgow then view this summit? Well, walking around Glasgow towards the end of the week, it was quite clear how the city felt about where the summit had reached. If you remember Greta Thunberg's blah, blah, blah statement, well, all over Glasgow, there were these posters. And I don't know if that just means that there was a very active poster putting up sector in Glasgow. I think it was just generally a sense amongst young people in particular who were at the COP that there was a lot of talking, but very little action, a lot of pledges, but not a great deal of active commitment. That was also true in terms of representation at the COP, partly due to COVID restrictions, partly due to the location of the summit, and partly due to visa restrictions. Many of the indigenous people from the Southern Hemisphere, were either absent or sent very reduced delegations, which meant that they had limited presence and also limited impact on the COP. It was argued by some that this was the most discriminatory COP ever, which doesn't really sound well or give us a great deal of hope in terms of seeing this COP as being truly representative or including the multiple voices from all around the planet. Here's one of the contradictions that kind of intrigues me, and which we at the centre are working on and thinking through and working with agencies to mitigate some of these consequences. You see, because one of the foci at the COP was the idea of moving to cleaner, greener energies, and in particular, the commitment of car companies to promote green energy, to move towards battery power. But there's a contradiction at work, because if we are moving to battery power and we are mining the earth's resources, particularly cobalt and other rare earth minerals that are necessary to drive the green economy, we've then got to be concerned about social responsibility and the social impact. And about 30–40%, we know, of the world's rare earth minerals are being mined in the Congo. And that leaves us with some critical questions to address regarding social justice and equality.
This is one of the thousands of unregulated unmonitored mines in the DRC. It's crawling with children, working like modern-day slaves. A 12-hour-long day of punishing work may earn them the equivalent of £1. Although one of the poorest countries on earth, DRC is rich in minerals. But a history of brutal colonial exploitation looks like being repeated now in 2017. Much of it's mined by hand, with rudimentary tools in harsh, potentially hazardous conditions. And wretched whether or not, the rush is on for a mineral the DRC has in great abundance, cobalt, and it's fast becoming more precious than gold. It's a critical...
Whoops, not sure what happened there. Seems to have...
It's fast becoming more precious than gold. It's a critical...
Whoops, hold on. So, for some reason there, the my download didn't work correctly, but you get the gist of what they're talking about. We have a predicament where, on the one hand, in the Northern Hemisphere, the race to carbon neutrality is being played out in environmental policies, which work locally, but don't necessarily take into consideration the global picture. Issues around supply chain, around ethics, around global impact. That's something to consider, and something which wasn't necessarily addressed at the COP. What we did find, though, which was really encouraging, is how local communities are responding. For example, in South London, there is an organisation made up of artists and shopkeepers and other members of the local community who are working towards improving air pollution just by making local people much more aware of the levels of air pollution and how they can go about engaging with their local councillors, with their politicians and with local government to improve air quality. So that was quite encouraging to see that there were local communities who were present and articulating and engaging the wider community with their concerns on how they can engage social justice themes while moving towards a zero carbon environment. Something that we're attempting to do at Winchester, just to kind of pull this to a close. How then do we take seriously the need for climate justice to be folded into social justice? But one of the ways in which we try and do this within the institute, within the university, and with the agencies that we're working with is to take what we call an intersectional approach, to recognize that every attempt to move towards zero carbon, every attempt to become much more environmentally aware has a social consequence. And therefore, you've got to ask critical questions about power, about class, about who benefits, who loses out, to mitigate the negative underside of how we develop more environmentally progressive policies. And that means being inclusive at the local level, thinking about who is left out of the discussion and how we might be able to include them, who's left out of the training and skills development, and how can we make sure that our progress is much more inclusive. So, for example, one of the projects that we're developing at the Institute at the moment is a partnership between the local prison, Winchester Prison, and also Hampshire and the Isle of Wight Wildlife Trust, which is a rewilding training course for offenders within the prison. Why do this? Well, partly because they have the space, the prison, to do this, to facilitate rewilding, but also because we're trying to engage offenders, working class white men, who are generally left out of discussions on climate change and social justice and issues around the environment, but engaging them with rewilding as a skill, as a qualification that they can take outside of prison to develop themselves. One dimension of it. The other dimension is obviously it's psychologically quite good getting men out of cells and out into gardens and doing constructive things, but also engaging them with issues around environmental justice, environmental degradation, and how they can be a part of the solution. So again, you see, this is how we fold climate justice into social justice, taking into consideration what's happening in the local community. And just to end with this, one of the things that we were also involved in at COP, I thought I'd introduce a bit of theory at the end. You know, Antonio Gramsci, the neo-Marxist Italian invented the idea of counter-hegemony and war of positioning. He argued that if you want to win any kind of political battle, you have to win the cultural battle, what's colloquially termed winning the hearts and minds of people. And one way in which we're attempting to do that as well in our work is through culture, through popular culture. If we can engage young people through popular culture, through music, through the arts, to think critically about sustainability, to engage in discussion and action around climate justice, then that's one of the ways in which you can begin the process. So one of the things that we engaged with in Glasgow as part of a team that helped to choreograph a reversioning of Marvin Gaye's 1971 hit Mercy, Mercy Me. This was a partnership with Christian Aid. It's the only song ever by a soul artist that deals with environmental degradation. You have to be in your 50s to remember Marvin Gaye from the 1970s, unless you're a big soul fan. You could be younger and be a soul fan. Not an age thing. So one of the things that we did was we got the Kingdom Choir, who made their fame from performing at Harry and Meghan's wedding, to reversion this. And this is, I'm just going to play you a few minutes from their version of Marvin Gaye's song. This is going to be cut and edited into a short film by Christian Aid for schools and colleges. They'll have more contemporary urban artists involved in this as well. But this was just one of the pieces that we were involved in with Christian Aid. I'm just going to pull it up to the point where it starts, because, you know, with these choirs, they take a bit of a while to get everybody in tune. So here we go. There we go. Let's see if we speed it up a bit. There we go. They did take a while to get set. That's just that. So, here we go.
Oh, mercy, mercy. All things ain't what they used to be. Now, where did all the blue skies go? Oh, mercy, mercy. Wow. All things ain't what they used to be. No.
Yep, that was, I'll just stop there for the interest of time, but if you ever get a chance to revisit the song, you'll see it's one of the only songs in soul music history where environmental degradation, the radiation, pollution in the sea and in the sky is folded into soul music, is folded into questions of social justice, connecting social justice to climate justice. So again, that's one of the ways in which we're attempting to engage with the broader community, using music and popular culture to engage young people or people with these issues as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Robert. That's really interesting. So if anyone does have any questions for Robert, do pop them in the chat and we'll sort of pass them over to Robert. But just while we're waiting, watching COP from the outside, as a lot of us were, sort of through news and podcasts and that sort of stuff, there seemed to be a real contrast between the sort of the business and the academics and the think tank people who were at COP, who were all terribly excited because the atmosphere was so much better than they'd seen at previous COPs, and they felt there was a real sort of engagement and progressive feel to it, to then the sort of activist people who were outside, and, you know, Greta made her blah, blah, blah comment actually quite early on in COP, before they'd really had a chance to say anything, who all thought, yeah, this is just more of the same. We've heard it all before at previous COPs. Do you think that contrast was real, or was that people trying to get their soundbite out? And if it is real, what do we do about it? How do we get everyone working together?
I think that contradiction is really accurate. And I would say that the activists were critical all the way through because they understood that the agreements that were being made were non-binding. And from learning from previous COPs, when they're non-binding, they don't have the same impact or effect or energy or urgency. So there was a sense that this was just about talking. Also, we've got to remember that there was an absence of many delegations from developing countries, or they sent very small delegations, and therefore, who was this COP for? It wasn't a global event. It was dominated not only by big corporations, but by powerful, rich Western countries. So consequently, we're left with an agreement that maintains the status quo rather than radically changing it. What did impress me, though, was the energy of the young people and the desire to see change beyond this COP, and a recognition that change is going to come from the bottom up rather than the top down.
Okay, great, thank you. Just you mentioned the sort of big industrial nations there. I've just got one question on the chat. I think we heard in the news that the oil industry was the single biggest delegation there. Do you think they hijacked it? Did they have too much influence?
Well, there's some debate about that, but what I would do is frame that within a wider analysis of representation. For example, Brazil sent 500 delegates, 400 to 500 delegates. In comparison, some of the smaller islands in the Pacific and in the Caribbean could only send half a dozen people. You know, so who's going to be on every committee? Who's going to be shaping the decisions? It was quite clear that really countries with vested interest in slow change were the ones who had the greatest input. Corporations with vested interest in so that's part of the problem that was perceived by many of the activists, many of the commentators, many of the news networks as well. And so consequently, what we ended up with was a very watered down COP, you know, at the very, very end. So the sense is that it is business as usual, and that real change will have to come from somewhere else.
Great, thank you very much. I think we'll leave that there then, because we're just about on time, so that's a good place to stop. Thank you very much, Robert. So I'm going to talk to you now about carbon footprinting and how to do your first sort of basic carbon footprint. And we have a little poll for you using another QR code just to see how many of you have already started measuring your carbon footprint. I read a stat from a couple of years ago that suggested 80% of SMEs haven't actually started carbon footprinting yet. So if you've got your phone available, you can scan that and fill in the form, and then we can see whether that is also true of our audience or not. We've talked about carbon footprinting a number of times over the years. What I particularly want to talk about today is to those people who haven't done a carbon footprint. We're going to send you all a blank spreadsheet, which is a simplified version of the spreadsheet I use at Marwell, and which is very similar to any other tools that you can see online. There are quite a lot of these available. The advantage of having a spreadsheet yourself is obviously means you can do a bit and come back to it. You don't have to have all the data available at one time when you sit down to use an online tool. So this is quite a useful way of gathering that data into one place if you then want to go on and use an online tool that may then give you some recommendations afterwards. So we're going to be sending all the delegates a copy of this spreadsheet after the event, so you can all have a go if you haven't done already. Save my slides to advance. Very temperamental. One of those things that always works when you practice it and always goes wrong when you start doing it properly. So just a quick couple of definitions to start with. You'll hear the distinction made quite often between direct emissions and indirect emissions. And the direct emissions are those that happen typically from your site or from your vehicles, from your equipment. So anything that is directly under your control, burning oil, burning gas, leaking refrigerants, anything that's happening on your site is your direct emissions that are your responsibility. And then what you've got is probably a much larger amount of indirect emissions, which are emissions that happen from somebody else's premises, from somebody else's equipment, but happen because they're providing services to you. And that could be anything from generating the electricity you use, to treating your sewage, handling your waste, making the products or the parts that you assemble into your products that you sell. Could be your accountant. Almost anything you can think of that's in your supply chain falls under indirect emissions. We're going to focus today particularly on those direct emissions and on the indirect ones resulting from energy consumption. We're not going to go into the wider supply chain. We're going to leave that for an event next year. And more important, perhaps, when you look at greenhouse gas reporting, you'll see it divided into 3 scopes, as they call it. And so all of those direct emissions fall under scope 1, which is something that everybody measures when they're doing a carbon footprint. And then the indirect emissions are divided up into scope 2, which is the energy part of the indirect emissions. And that's what most people are measuring. For most people, that's electricity. Occasionally, some people in certain businesses are also obtaining things like heat or steam or cooling from a third party. That's relatively unusual. If you're a business in Southampton city centre or on the district heating network, then your heat is a scope 2 emission. But for most people, their only scope 2 emission is going to be electricity. And then the scope 3 is everything else in your supply chain that we're not going to talk about today. Diagrammatically, it might sometimes helps to look at it this way. You can see you've got the small circle in the centre, which is your business, which is where all those direct emissions are. Then you've got the scope 2, the energy coming into your business, and then you've got the much broader scope 3 around the outside with all the bits and pieces that are contributing to your wider footprint. And you can see obviously the scope 3 is a lot bigger in most people's cases. But today we're just going to focus on the scope 1 and 2, which is the simplest bit, which is where everyone starts when they're doing their carbon footprint. That's what it will sort of look like when you're finished with it. I've divided it up into various different types of processes in terms of using fuels in your scope 1, and then you can see the energy there at the bottom. Your business, everyone's business is going to be different. I've shown here a number of different buildings. You may well only have one building, perhaps you've got one building, but it's got a couple of different metered processes. The more detail you can get into the carbon footprint, the easier it is then to look at where you're going to take action. So you can see which parts of your processes, which part of your businesses are the biggest emitters. So the more detail you can create at the start, the easier it is then to sort of think about when you're setting your targets, where you're going to take action first. And where you get your data from is obviously quite important. If we look at heating first, ideally you'll be using meter readings. Perhaps that's if you're on mains gas, you're reading your gas meter, and then obviously the more often you read it, the more detail you get, and the easier it is to take action. Alternatively, you might be taking your data from invoices. So you could get your monthly invoice or your quarterly invoice from your gas company or from your energy company, and you can take the data from that. Or you might be like us and you have LPG, in which case you've got delivery notes that say how many litres of fuel they delivered. There are differences in accuracy of data. Your meter readings are obviously much more accurate to the period of reporting that you're looking at. So if you're looking over a year, so you want to report your commissions for 2021, you can read your meter at the start of the year and you can read at the end of the year, and you know exactly how much gas, in this case, you've consumed. Whereas if you're using something like an invoice, they could be using an estimated reading, so you haven't got quite as much accuracy as you would have from the direct readings. Or if you're using a delivery note, they may have delivered, in this case, 1,266 litres, but actually you may not have used that all within that year. There could be some left, and if you haven't got a meter reading, you're not quite sure how much less. So there's a lot of approximation going on. So always use the most accurate means of measuring whatever it is you're measuring, in this case heating, that you can. And then you plonk those numbers obviously into your spreadsheet. And in this case, obviously I've used some dummy figures, and then you add in a conversion factor, which will convert that into your equivalent amount of carbon dioxide. And this is where it's very important to remember which units you were measuring when you were collecting all your data. So if you're using a gas meter reading, it was probably in cubic meters. So you need the conversion factor for cubic meters. If you were taking it from your invoice, it might have been measured in kilowatt hours, in which case there's a different conversion factor. So you need to be make sure you remember to note down which units you're using when you take all that data into account. And all of these conversion factors are available from the government, which I'll come to later, as to where you find all these different conversion factors that you put into the spreadsheet to give you your totals. But once you've got the data, it is a relatively straightforward process to convert that then into the carbon dioxide equivalent. And similarly for transport fuels, if you've just got a small number of vehicles that are out on the road every day doing sort of deliveries or collecting parts and that sort of stuff, then you're probably using petrol station receipts as your data gathering method. And that's pretty accurate because the receipt will tell you exactly how much you bought. And then you'll use all that until you next go to the petrol station. So you'll have a good idea of how much fuel you used over the year. If you're a slightly larger organisation like ourselves, you might have your own fuel tank on site that you're using for your vehicles, in which case you might want to use delivery note data. But again, there is that slight approximation, because if you had 500 litres in this case delivered in December, you might not have used it all by the end of the year. So you've got to use some approximations to make sure you've got an idea of how much you used within your reporting period. You might also be doing things like vehicle monitoring. So if you're doing regular vehicle checks and noting down the mileage, you can use your vehicle mileage as a way of monitoring the carbon footprints of your vehicles. But again, that's a little bit less accurate again, because you're using estimated figures for converting mileage into carbon dioxide, which will vary depending on the size of the engine, how well maintained it is, how efficiently the person is driving. So if you can use actual fuel data, it'll be more accurate than trying to estimate from mileage. And again, you plonk those numbers into your spreadsheet and add in the relevant conversion factor for the type of fuel. And you can see here I've got 2 columns of diesel and 2 columns of petrol. I could be reporting that all as one column for convenience sake, but by dividing it up, I might get a little bit of variation and recognizing that actually my fleet vehicles that are going, in our case, out of the zoo and driving longer distances when they go to pick up supplies are a bigger contribution to our carbon footprint than our cycle vehicles that are just driving around within the park, in our case, delivering animal feed to animal houses. So by separating out the different types of vehicles, I can get a better idea of where I want to take action. So if you can do that, it's always a good idea. More detail is always better, even if it takes you a bit longer to do. And then finally, in scope 1, we have refrigeration. Lots of people have refrigeration, whether that's if you're a cafe or a shop, you might have some large-scale refrigeration for food and supplies, or you might be talking about air conditioning units. But hopefully you are getting those serviced regularly, so they're not leaking. But most refrigerants, even modern ones, are still quite potent greenhouse gas contributors. So it is important to know whether they're leaking or not. And within the conversion factors, there is a method for estimating leakage, so that if you don't know whether you've leaked or not, there's a sort of industry average for a percentage leakage a year. So you can use that figure, but again, it's not terribly accurate because you don't know how much your equipment is leaking. And if you're getting it well maintained, then it probably isn't leaking at all. So you could be reporting a greenhouse gas emission that doesn't exist. So ours is serviced a couple of times a year, and one of the service items is a leak check. And if it is leaking, then in the comments at the bottom, they will report that, oh yes, we found a leak, and we topped it up with 1 kilogram of refrigerant. And so if my refrigerant has been topped up by 1 kilogram, I know I must have leaked 1 kilogram, and I can report that in my scope 1 emissions. And it's very important that you note down which type of refrigerant was leaking, because they all have slightly different greenhouse gas potential. So they've got a different conversion factor for converting into carbon dioxide. So if you've got more than one type of refrigerant or refrigeration unit, they may have different refrigerants depending on their age and when they're manufactured or the type of equipment they are. We've got quite a lot of different ones across our site, which is quite annoying because it all makes them slightly different ways of calculating. But all of those conversion factors are in the conversion data that we'll come on to. So they are relatively easy to do once you've got an understanding of what equipment you've got and what the refrigeration is. This is all just a matter of looking up the right numbers, plugging it into the spreadsheet, and then you're giving you an answer. And then electricity, again, much the same. You can take your data from a number of sources. Obviously, meter reads are the easiest one. So if you're reading your meter, I would hope most people are reading their meters at least monthly. If you're a larger site and you've got half-hourly meters, then you may well be getting data from your energy company about your consumption patterns over 24 hours, over a month, over a year. So as well as having very good data for managing your energy consumption, you've also got very good data for doing your carbon footprint, which is very useful. You can, again, use your invoices, which should also be detailing your consumption. But again, particularly if you're a smaller company, your invoices are probably quite often estimated and are not necessarily very accurate. So again, if you can read the meter, then you will get the most accurate data you can for when it comes to calculating your carbon footprint. And again, if you've got more than 1 meter, then you have more detail about where to take action later. So it's good to record them separately if you can. And then with the scope 2, there's particularly this difference in whether you're looking at what they call a market-based approach or a location-based approach. So if you've changed to a renewable energy tariff and you're paying that bit extra for energy that's come from a renewable source that you can then report as zero carbon, then you want to report that slightly differently. So we've been on a renewable energy tariff for a number of years. So our the amount of carbon per kilowatt hour is 0, and we get that. Obviously, that information comes straight from the supplier who declare it as 0. But the location-based approach is saying, well, actually, the electricity that comes out of your sockets is the same as everybody else's, and so there is this national grid average that says, actually, this is the carbon associated with your electricity. And so most people will report both, and they say, this is the amount of carbon associated with our electricity, but because we buy renewables, we're reporting it as 0. And that's just part of the transparency so that people can see exactly what your carbon mix is. It's possible you're somewhere between the two, and you've got an energy supplier who is buying partly renewable and then partly using another form of generation. And so each energy company will also report their own carbon intensity factors. So you can use those if you want to. So generally, you'd use your energy company in the market, your energy company's data in the market-based approach, and then you'll use the conversion factors, the national figure for the grid average, in the location-based approach. And you'd report both of those just so people understand exactly what you're claiming and how you reach that claim. Conversion factors are all available online from DEFRA on this website. I should have the links there. And they produce new sets of these figures every year because they do change, particularly obviously the grid average electricity changes every year. But as more research is done, the data in various other categories changes every year. So you do need to make sure you've downloaded the right set of data for the right year. So in the example I'm using 2021 data because that data is now available. But if you want to take your baseline as last year or the year before, then make sure you download the right set of data for the year that you're collecting the data on. And when you download it, it'll look a bit like this. Whole load of tabs along the bottom. I don't know how clear you can see that depending on your screen, but you can see there's a whole bunch of tabs for the different types of emissions you might have. And the key ones here are obviously those first couple where you've got the fuels. So that's your gas, your diesel, LPG, coal if you're still using coal. Yeah, anything, all these foods you can think of will be in there. And then there's a separate one for bioenergy if you're like us and you've got a wood chip boiler. And then if you move along a bit, you can see there's an electricity tab, which is where you find that grid average one. And then lots of other tabs for different types of emissions if you want to go into more detail, particularly when you get into scope 3 reporting. There's a lot of detail there into how to tackle things like waste and sewage and that sort of stuff. So when you go into each of those tabs, this is the fuel one. It has a bunch of gaseous fuels that you can look at. So this is where I got the data for the LPG that was on the spreadsheet, the conversion factor, and the natural gas, which is if you're on the gas main, that's what you're coming out of your taps. Is that the word? So lots of different types depending on what your usage is. And then if you were to scroll down that page, you've then got solid fuels underneath, your liquid fuels and solid fuels underneath. So all the conversion factors you could possibly want are all in these spreadsheets. I'm just waiting for you to plug it into your own conversion spreadsheet to get your total. I'll tell you what you end up with. is a grand total at the bottom, and you can see in this particular worked example, if I were to look at the location based, including electricity, I've got a carbon footprint of 310 tons, or 310.5. But if I were to subtract my electricity, because I'm buying it on a renewable tariff, then I've only got 161 tons of carbon. And so I think, right, that's great. I can report how much carbon I've saved by switching to renewable, and then I can look at all those other carbon emissions and say, right, these are the ones I'm going to tackle next. And I think me done. So that was a sort of whistle-top tour of the basic of carbon footprinting. So we are going to send you those blank spreadsheets after this session, and you can have a go for yourselves. And we've got a session coming up again next year where we'll talk a bit more about the sort of scope 3 stuff, but we'd also like to get your feedback if you hadn't done a carbon footprint today, if you tried it, and how did you get on? And Wendy is hopefully going to tell us whether we managed to get any responses to our poll.
Indeed, yes. This is the moment where I get to say our survey says, in fact. Thank you so much for answering the poll there. I've got some figures for you. So we asked the question, have you got an up-to-date carbon footprint? Our survey says 44% of you do. Okay, so that's an interesting number, 44%. We've got 22% saying no, but we're committed to do it this year. So that's promising. That takes us up to 66%. We got 11% saying we have no idea, they don't tell us. Sometimes that we're in bigger organisations and we don't always know what's going on. And we got another 22% saying we have no, we don't. So that's a little bit of a mixed situation there, with a 44% of yes, another 22 committed to do it this year.
Good. Oh, that's encouraging, at least. Yeah. I'm just scrolling through the chat. We've got a couple of points people have made. There's some interesting home working calculations people have been talking about. That's quite exciting. I know, Wendy, you did an estimation of the possible
actually within
depending
this,
on people's home situations.
Exactly, within this forum as well, there is, and I've popped it there in the chat, there is a Sustainable Business Network session, which was the Rocky Road to Recovery from COVID, that we did, way back last year. And if you go to that video and go for time code 33 minutes, that takes you through a very straightforward analysis of that, and all the maths is in there to enable you to do it, actually. So it can be a challenging one, particularly because you may find yourself starting to ask of your staff maybe some questions about their households that perhaps they don't wish to necessarily answer, but there's some models that you can apply there if you feel that's a little bit sensitive area. So really you can go to the depths of the data that you can reasonably get from your staff and feel comfortable getting.
Yeah. Okay. Yes, I mean, you're absolutely right. Everyone's personal situations are different. In my case, I have a lodger at home, so my house is heated during the day anyway. So I don't have an additional heating impact from working from home. But obviously, other people who maybe both partners are working or they live on their own, they've got a big change in circumstances from working from home, or if they've built themselves a fancy home office out in the garden. That could be a benefit if they're not heating a home, they're just heating a small office, or it could be a disaster if they're now heating both. So a lot of variation depending on their personal circumstances. So if you want to do that for your organisation, you do unfortunately need to dig into a little bit of personal information from your staff, which needs to be sensitively handled. We just got a question there from Ian about carbon savings since we started doing our footprint, and absolutely, yeah, we measured our baseline in 2008, and since then we've reduced ours by something like 83%, I think it is. Obviously, a significant part of that was our switch to renewable energy, because we use a lot of electricity at Marwell, but we have since then been tackling a lot of our big carbon emitters, particularly in our case, oil-fired heating. And vehicles, I have to say, is something we're trying to tackle, but we haven't got round to those yet. Cash savings. Yes, and we have. obviously the electricity is sort of comparable in price, so there isn't really a saving on electricity, but we have installed lots of solar panels. So we're now generating, I can't remember what it is, something like 150,000 kilowatt hours a year on site. So obviously that's electricity we're not paying for. And we've got a wood chip boiler now that's replaced one of our oil-fired heating systems. So obviously that's a lot cheaper. And you may have seen in the press that we've just built a large boiler that's burning animal waste. So that's essentially free fuel. So yes, we have managed to achieve both cash savings as well as carbon savings. So both are possible. Right, I'm going to move on now because we are getting on in time. So I'm going to introduce Eva. Eva is a business development manager for an organisation called Planet Mark. Some of you may be aware Planet Mark were doing a zero carbon tour leading up to COP in an electric bus, just demonstrating what was possible and talking to people about obviously carbon reductions and particularly sort of target setting and making sure people are aware when people talk about zero carbon and climate neutral, what it all actually meant. So over to you, Eva.
Good morning, everyone. Duncan, thank you very much for inviting me here, and I'm really happy to join you and talk about net zero target settings and just really talking about what net zero is. So as part of the agenda today, I thought I'm going to talk through why net zero is very important and helping you understand what it means, how it impacts your organization, and how you can organize your own company to set a credible target and see what actions you can be taken and just to get stuck in. So as Duncan mentioned as well, yes, we run a zero carbon tour around the UK for just over 3 months in a run up to COP26. And we just had our finale event last week, which was fabulous. So during the tour, we were talking about net zero to thousands of people and hundreds of organizations, from very large businesses to lots of SMEs and micro businesses as well. So we were running the event from early September, and actually we've been to Southampton as well, where we were hosted by the Southampton City Council, so it's not far away from you. So the tour of the aim was to help organizations understand what net zero is and what the Race to Zero campaign is, and talk about how it affects their organizations. And we also wanted to gather carbon stories to collect those stories from these similar organizations, small and large organizations who are on this journey already, to show the others that it can be done and just show them examples and a bit of support how they can start on this journey as well. So our aim was to do that with this knowledge, companies will be more confident in setting credible net zero targets. So in the picture you see Eden Project, so that was actually at the launch of our tour. But since then, we've been all around the country. So we've been in England, Wales, Scotland, and even in Northern Ireland, where we've been using a hydrogen fuel bus. So the blue coach you're seeing, that was one of the first electric coaches in the UK. And that hydrogen bus was actually made in Ballymenat in Northern Ireland. So that was the first double-decker hydrogen bus that has been used in the world. And yeah, during the tour, we also wanted to prove that large vehicles can also run with only one charge for hundreds of miles. So hopefully we proved that. And I wanted to say a couple of words about what we do. So similarly to Carbonfootprintcom, we help organizations to measure and independently verify their carbon footprint. And we also measure their social value as well. And then we use that data to engage with the organizations and teams to really bring their passion from outside of the workplace and really allow them to play an active role in the company. So I've seen in the chats, there was a question coming up, like, how do you know if you're doing it? As the question from the management team, from the board, and to push pressure on them as well. So if it's not been done, just this is the right way to start it. And yeah, so it's so important as well then to communicate the measurement and your carbon footprint externally, but to your employees as well. So they already know that you are on the path to measure and reduce the carbon. And I thought I'd just bring this example here, Rock Hill Pest Control Services. I thought I entered them in here because they are based in Ringwood, so half an hour away from Winchester. So it doesn't really matter how small or large your company is. The interesting thing is that if you are grabbing hold of your actual measuring your carbon footprint emissions, you will learn so much in the process. And with that knowledge, you can really influence others as well. So if you're a small organization and you're wondering, oh, I only have 5 employees, and what can I do? My carbon footprint is possibly really small. But the thing is, it's by doing that and then start to communicate it, then it will trickle down into your supply chain, but also to your customers as well. So no matter how small or large your organization is, you can also set up a net zero target, and yeah, it's just really starting on that journey. And I thought that I talk a little bit about terminology here as well, and Duncan really nicely summarized up what scope 1, 2, and 3 are. And yes, you will have a session on scope 3 as well, but I thought to understand net zero, we need to a little bit talk about the scope 3 as well. So on this figure, you can see down in the middle, you got your direct and indirect scope 1 and 2 emissions. So scope 1 is your fuels, what you're burning. So yes, it's your natural gas, and it's the fuel your cars are using, and yes, it's your refrigerant gas as well. And in a scope 3 is electricity, what you're consuming and what you're buying. And so it's really about controlling the consumption, but also the scope 2's other part is that some of the transport and distribution of that electricity. And then on both of these sides, you see these 2 big vans. And this shows your full scope 3 emissions. So what these are? So these are 15 categories, which includes your supply chain. But there are some scope 3 emissions here which are easier to start to tackle and start measuring, such as your business travel. You can create surveys and measure your employee commuting as well. So the mode of transport, distance taken. Also waste and water are in here. And not all of these scope 3 emissions will be material for your organization. So for example, if you're a service-based company, for example, as a fantasy firm, then your scope 3 will be much smaller compared to, for example, a cleaning product manufacturer company. So the very important thing is that just look through these scope 3 emissions and think about which is relevant for your business, and also identifying where you are probably having the biggest emission. So for example, you work with a handful of suppliers, and identifying where those biggest hotspots might be. So where do you spend the most, or which supplier you are purchasing the most from? So it's really about action and collaborating with your supply chain as well, and involve your customers as well, and just really identifying where those biggest emissions are. So these slides give you a short description of what net zero carbon looks like. So here, I'm just going to bring all of these up. So in this first scope 1 and 2 emissions, so direct and purchase emissions, so you will need to bring this down to 0. And then just reminding of what these are. So this is a burning natural gas in your property, fueling your vehicles with diesel or petrol, and this is what you will need to get down to 0. And then maybe you say that, how are we going to do that? Now we can see here some of the examples and ideas of how to reduce it. So using vehicles in your fleet, and try to decarbonize the fleet to bring it down to 0, or also switch to renewable energy supplier as well, and also install renewable energy generation. So it's amazing to hear that, Duncan, they're already doing it at the zoo. So then we arrive to scope 3, which is a huge piece, and you're going to start to measure all these categories as well. So first you need to understand which of these scope 3 categories are material for you, and then put a plan in place to measure all of these as well. So scope 1 and 2 get to 0, scope 3 get close to 0 as you possibly can, which means obviously engaging with your suppliers as well. And then, so you have to reduce that to 90%. And then that residual emissions, what you will have in the end, you can offset those, and you have to offset those. And I'll have another slide on offsetting. And that's how you achieve net zero at the end of your target year. And so this graph shows 2 little lines for you. So one is true zero, where a company either would go down to true zero. But net zero, so for example, if you're a bicycle producer, manufacturer, you will never be able to take it down to true zero because there is still material in your business. So reduce it down to a minimum, and then use carbon removal offsets to achieve that net zero target. And just a couple of things and words about offsetting. So there are 2 major types of offsets, and this is very important to acknowledge these and understand these. So the typical offsets you might knowing about is a carbon avoidance offset. So these offsets are things like wind farm, solar PV, electric cook stove, things that can stop carbon from entering the atmosphere and replace carbon emitting type activities. So these are the type of offsets you might come across quite often for becoming carbon neutral as well. But you can't use these in a case of net zero. So the only offsets you can use are carbon removal offsets. And the difference is that the only way to get to net zero is actively sequester carbon out of the atmosphere. So there are 2 primary ways of doing it. One is technology-based and one is nature-based solutions. So technology-based is, for example, carbon capture and storage. At the moment, they're really not at scale. So you will most likely need to look into carbon removal projects, which are natural carbon sinks. For example, tree planting or peatlands, protected peatlands, seagrass projects as well. So key thing here, yes, use carbon removal projects, but also be careful about the choices you're making when buying these offsets, because they're different. So you should go for certified footprint. So for example, gold standard or VCS standard offsets. And I think this slide is also very important because we came across a lot during the tour as well that there's a big confusion in between carbon neutral and net zero, and these are kind of used all the time and not really differentiated from each other. So carbon neutral is a great step along the way to become net zero because it means that you are measuring your carbon emissions and also having a reduction plan. But the emissions you have to measure is only the scope 1 and 2 emissions. And carbon neutral, so doesn't require measuring your scope 3 emissions. So it does require measuring and having reduction targets, and it's all aligned with the PAS 2060 standard. But then on net zero, you see that and we still didn't really get a 100% definition at COP what everyone wanted. But the reason why net zero is important, it will include everything. So it's not just the scope 1 and 2 emissions, but the whole supply chain, your scope 3 emissions as well. And then in the end, you can only use a residual carbon removal offsets. And I thought, because there's lots of terminologies going around, confusing terms like climate positive, carbon neutral, climate negative. Yes, there are standard definitions here, and I'm sure that the slides will be shared later on. So I just wanted to put them here as well. So let's talk a little bit about measurement and goal setting. So measurement is a key, and as Duncan mentioned as well, it's so important to have as accurate data as you can and as detailed data as you can. So this is a little bit simplified kind of breakdown of a carbon footprint in a pie chart. So you can really then identify those areas where you have the biggest impact to the environment. And you can really put this in front of your management team and your employees and discuss what you can do about it and get ideas from the organizations how to cut it down. So as soon as you're showing this really robust carbon footprint, which you can get by filling in this form as well, the table that you will receive as well, or use any organizations to help you with that calculation, then you can use that data to put up in front of your customers. You can provide this data when they're asking you as someone within their supply chain to provide evidence. So this is a key tool for you. And I know this slide looks a little bit complicated and scary, but I just wanted to give you an idea of what it might look like to set out a good, better, and best format, and what net zero carbon might look like in these time trajectories. So the science-based targets, net zero standard, differentiate these to near-term and long-term targets. So the near-term targets are 5 to 10 years targets. So these are in line with the 1.5 degree pathway. And the long-term targets are to reduce emissions to net zero by no longer than 2050 and reduce emissions by 90% or more for most companies, and then remove carbon at the end. So we know that all companies in the UK have to get to net zero by 2050. The question is how fast you need to do it. So down in the bottom, you can see what a minimum standard can look like to comply with this. And we know that we have to net zero. We know that we have to halve our emissions by 2030 in accordance with the science-based targets. So you at least have to halve your emissions by 2030, but you can then stretch out the rest of your carbon emissions to 2050. To be frank, it's unlikely that it's going to be good enough. So the question for you might be, can I do better than this? Can you get your scope 1 and 2 down to net zero by 2030, and then, for example, stretch out some of your scope 3 emissions to 35 or 40? So this is what good can be. So the best class and the leading organizations are signing up to zero by 2030, for example. And so they set ambitious targets to be zero by 2030. So that means they will have to reduce scope 1 and 2 to zero, and they have to reduce scope 3 emissions to 90% and then offset the residual. So yes, so this is just, I wanted to show you that it also can really depend on how big your supply chain, the type of your business. So really consider that. So also start speaking with your suppliers and ask them like what they're already doing. So, and also this gradual increase in ambition can really provide opportunities to collaborate then across this whole value chain and really support each other with the suppliers and customers to decarbonize. But also with ambitious targets, you can allow your company to focus on making really steep cuts in your most material emissions and allowing yourselves to work through the complexity of your scopes. So what we recommend, so we generally suggesting companies to measure your scope 1 and 2 emissions at least. And also you've seen there are those scope 3 categories where it's quite easy to collect data to. So start measuring it, wrapping your arms around this already like readily available data, and then look into how can you collect information from your suppliers as well, and how you can collaborate with them. So collaboration is key. And so as part of the, with the Zero Carbon Tool, we've been officially partnered with the UN-backed Race to Zero program. So really fully advocating this, and these are the first 4 steps, what they kind of put out for everyone to join the Race to Zero and achieve net zero and have to avoid the pledge plague, really, because yes, we heard lots of organizations doing it, but to avoid the pledge plague, comply with this. So pledge, in an open place, and then make a plan, and then proceed into action, and they publish your progress every single year openly and transparently in the public domain. So these are the first steps you can take, and get stuck in. So yeah, so if you're ready already to set your target for net zero, to pledge to become net zero, you can do that through the Race to Zero website, or you can go to Zero Carbon Tour to our website as well, and pledge. And we know how to take action. So we know that as soon as you having these conversations inside of your organizations, the willingness is there from all the people inside of the company, because we're really pretty well aligned that we have to tackle climate crisis as fast as possible. It's an open door. There's a lot of passion and knowledge already inside of your organization. We also recommend that you start talking to your customers. Go upstream, find out how you can provide your goods and services in a better way, zeroing out your carbon and asking them how they can help you. It's a brilliant place to collaborate and find solutions there, because the suppliers are desperate to also innovate. And finally, put it in a public domain openly and transparently, and communicate your progress. So that's what we need to do to show everyone that we are on the same way, same page. And it's amazing that a toolkit will be shared with you, the carbon calculator table. But if you have further questions, I'll be happy to share the beginner's guide toolkit for you as well. Or if you have any questions about net zero or target setting, you can also get in touch with me by email or drop me a message on LinkedIn. And I just wanted to leave you on this slide. So we are all after this brighter future, right? So we know that we can do it, but we can only ever do it by working together.
Thank you very much, Eva. That's yeah, really important and very interesting. So again, if you'd like to pop any questions in the chat, I can pass those on to Eva. That'd be great. I noticed Wendy's also posted a link there to a previous Sustainable Business Network session about target setting. So if you have the time, do go and rewatch that on the YouTube channel. That would be great. I just had a quick question, actually, Eva. You gave quite a detailed definition of net zero, but you also mentioned that there's a developing standard. So is that definition, is that your definition, or is that a definition that you're anticipating coming out in the standard? And if so, when is that standard coming out?
Actually, so that science-based target net zero standard is defining it this way. So it's been published in October. So that's a kind of standard we can use. And we also aligning all of our kind of standards with that. But it's quite not legislatively kind of proven that net zero target, what it means. So this is why there are certain organizations kind of coming up with these definitions because we need to start acting on these things. And as businesses and individuals, you can already start making action without any legislation from top down.
Great, thank you. Just a question from Nancy, just talking about asking about businesses that are scaling up quickly, and therefore obviously they might take a baseline measurement when they're small, and then their carbon footprint essentially goes the wrong way. Do you have any advice for that type of organisation?
Yes, so we work with lots of organizations who are starting small and luckily their business is growing. But also if an organization has been operating for the past few years as well, so we come across this question quite a lot. 2020 was a very indifferent way to any years, and even 2021. So some of our existing members are looking at their 2019 carbon footprint data to start setting kind of targets and kind of build on those. Some organizations decided we will use 2021 because our business changed. We are doing flexible working now. We are encouraging our employees to do virtual meetings, reducing our travel. We're changing the ways we do business, and they choose that year. But then in terms of if an organization is growing, so there are two ways of measuring. Well, there are two ways of having your carbon footprint data. So there is absolute carbon footprint and data, but you can also measure your footprint by different intensity metrics as well. So, for example, by turnover or per employees as well. And when we are measuring the reductions of our members, so we do an annual certification where they have to measure and reduce their carbon every year. So we always compare in our measurement like for like. So compared to those scope 3 categories we included in the first year. So for example, scope 1 and 2 is covered, and then we only included business travel and water. In the following year, if they add, for example, other additional scope 3 categories like employee commuting and waste, then that reduction we will compare to what data they have. So that's one way to look at. Obviously, as you will capture more data with extending your measurement scope, your carbon footprint will be much greater. But then even if you only measure a few of these scopes, you can already start working on reducing those. So when you are getting to those additional scope 3 categories, you can then focus on those and have plans to reducing those, because the rest of the scopes are already looked after. So that's what we could kind of recommend as a first.
Yeah, and I think this is where transparency becomes very important. So if your carbon footprint has gone the wrong way because you've grown, then obviously make sure you make that clear if you're reporting. So yeah, this is why.
It's all about communication. Yes.
And particularly like with the COVID and the pandemic, our carbon footprint shrank by about an extra 5% last year, which was nothing we did. It was because our cafe was closed for most of the year, like everybody else's. So whilst it looks like a good news story, clearly it's not good news for the business. So it's about transparency. But also, if you're growing, this is your opportunity to grow in the right way. So if you possibly can, grow your business without growing your carbon emissions. If you're moving to a new premises, see if you can find it might be a bigger premises, but it might be more energy efficient. Or if you're adding more vehicles because you've got more people on the road, can you add electric vehicles rather than petrol vehicles? So if you are growing and you've got an opportunity to grow the right way rather than making the mistakes that everyone else made, which they've now got to correct. So don't borrow trouble for the future. Try and get it right now if you possibly can.
Yes, and as also technology evolves and we have amazing technology coming into the market as well. So we know that carbon emissions will be reduced through those new technologies as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Wendy, could you pop the feedback form up just to catch people before they all leave? So we've got a question coming in from Liz there, or more of a comment about scope 3 again. Scope 3 is everybody's headache at the moment if they've started measuring their carbon footprint, and particularly we talk about talking to suppliers. Eva, I don't know if you can answer this, but I've certainly spoken to some of our suppliers, and their response is generally, good grief, we haven't even started thinking about the carbon footprint of our products. So I physically can't measure my scope 3 on some of my product lines. So what do I do?
So I'm not a carbon expert in terms of the data crunching, but there are different ways of measuring scope 3. So the first tier would be measuring by spend. And then gradually you can improve that measurement by then taking into the life cycle assessment and the carbon footprint of that particular product as well. So that's the kind of third step. The middle one is taking the carbon associated with transporting those products and taking the weights of those products. So there is a kind of 3-tier kind of step to improve the quality of that data. But you can also, obviously, you don't want to cut at relationships with your suppliers. But what we see in Tesco is asking their supply chain to report on having net zero targets by end of 2022. So it really shows that as large organizations are asking their supply chain to do it, then that tier of suppliers will also ask their suppliers to do it. So your supplier would need to look into it. And it's amazing you have these tools. You can already then provide some of these tools for them to support them to measure their own footprint. So you have a better data and you can reduce then your Scope 3 emissions as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Wendy, sorry, did you have a comment?
Yeah, just to add to what Eva said there, absolutely. The easiest way with Scope 3, and Scope 3 can dominate your footprint and you may not even know it, but for science-based targets, you absolutely do need to know it, of course. And the easy way there, yes, on the spend basis, BASE does actually point you to a database of numbers that basically relates to the SIC code spend. So actually the straightforward screening of your Scope 3 could be done that way. I wouldn't pretend for 1 second that's going to be 100% accurate, but what that's going to do is be directionally correct and allow you to find where those hotspots are. And then obviously you hone that down and focus in on those big sources of your supply chain from there. So just to add that point in.
Thanks very much. We don't seem to have any more questions coming in on the chat. So I don't know if you had any last comments you wanted to make before we wrap up. Yes, that's a no then. So we're a few minutes early, but I'm sure no one will object to that. To get back to your day jobs. So thank you very much for everyone for coming, and thank you for your feedback if you've managed to fill in your QR code form. And we will see you for our next event, which I can't remember the date of. Wendy, can you remember what the next date of the next event is?
It's in the new year, isn't it,
yes.
Duncan? We will publish
Look out for the communication.
those very soon on the communications. Absolutely.
Yeah, we'll be back with you in January and February next year. So thank you very much, Eva.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you to Robert in his absence, and thank you to everyone for attending.